Welcome to Killer PHP. This is Steph Mischuk, and in this video tutorial, we're going to cover one of the fundamental constructs in the PHP language, something called a loop. Loops are basically tools in PHP that allows you to loop through things. It allows you to do repetitive tasks. Typically, you would use loops to do things like process records in a database, or maybe loop through an array, for instance. Like so many other things in PHP, I believe that once you see the code and you actually write the code, you're going to find using loops pretty easy. So I've launched Dreamweaver, my PHP text editor, for this series of videos. And I started off by creating a variable, and you're going to see why I've done this. So let's actually create our first loop. This, of course, is the while loop, and use the keyword while. And I assume that you've done the conditional video tutorial where we looked at if statements, because it's the while loop is very similar to the if statement in one way, where the while loop works by checking to see whether or not the value held in between the brackets here is true. And if it is true, this gets run. And as long as this value here turns out to be true in between the brackets, and we're going to put a value in there in a second, this gets run over and over and over and over again, thus the loop. So let's create a little counter, and we'll do that by using this variable. So I gave the variable an initial value of 1. While this is equal to and less than, say, 10, we're going to tell it to, let's say, echo out. Now here's a new operator I want to introduce you to, the double plus plus sign. And that operator is called the increment operator, and I'll explain to you what it does in about 2 seconds here. So let me just start from the top. So this while loop basically works like an if statement, where this code here, anything in between the while loop opening and closing curly brackets, will get processed if whatever is in between these two brackets is true. So as long as the variable count is is less than or equal to 10, this will get run. So what we're doing, we're just echoing out the text hello to the page, and we're doing something very interesting here that I haven't shown you guys before. This double plus symbol is the increment operator. So what basically this does, this is a shortcut way of saying increase the value of the variable count by 1. That's what this does. So so the theory is, I should get rid of this maybe. The theory is that every time this loop runs, this variable value will be increased by 1. So it'll start off being equal to 1, then 2, and 3, and 4. And once it hits 10, the loop will stop, because it had reached this condition would have become false after 10, right? As long as it's equal to or less than 10. So actually when it hits 11 rather, it will stop processing. So let's run this code and see what happens. So I've popped open Firefox, and as you can see, the word hello has been printed to the page 10 times. So let's go back to our code and make a couple little changes, and we'll look at some interesting behavior. So for instance, so we hello ... So let's change that like so. Give it a space, and then we're going to use a concatenation operator, the little plus sign. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually print the value of count as we loop through. So we should see the loop increment as we go along. We should actually see the number increase. And what I'm going to actually do as well, I'm going to put in a HTML break so that it's a little bit cleaner. So let's take a look at this in the browser again. And there we go. So you see we've created 10 hellos, and you see it's printed out the numbers. And the reason it's printed out the numbers is because we've actually told PHP to print out the count variable value to the page. So there you go. This is a basic loop. This is the while loop. There's a couple other loop types that you can find in PHP. And essentially what you want to get out of this is it works like an if statement, a conditional statement, where as long as this value is true, this gets processed. Once this value is no longer true, it just skips that block and PHP will continue to process the code from the top down as it always does. The next type of loop we're going to look at is something called a for loop. And to speed things up, I've written the code already. So we're just going to look at the for loop and watch it in action. And we'll take it from there. The for loop looks complex at first. And I remember when I was learning this way back, I found it kind of complex. But what it does in a way is it sort of combines everything that we see in the while loop up here. I've commented it out so that it doesn't run on our page. But you notice, like with the while loop, I had the count variable. I initialized it out here, and then I set the condition here. And the condition, this is what the condition basically is, what the PHP script is looking for, whether it be a while loop or a for loop or an if statement, and so on. So what the for loop does, it gives you a much more compact way of looping, if you will. So I've initialized the variable here, and this is the condition. Basically, I'm telling it, if while the count is equal to or less than 10, do this, and this is increase the count. And I can also tell it to do stuff here as well. So it's a more compact way, and it pretty much does the same thing. One point I want to make is that this update, this is basically instructions to the loop, to PHP, what you do after a loop is completed. I want to point out this is done first, and then the PHP goes back and does this. So this will get printed to the page before it increments the count variable to the next level. This is the increment operator that we looked at in the while loop section of this, of course. So let's save that, and we're going to take a look at it in action. And here we go, for loop 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. So again, whether you're using the for loop or the while loop is really a question of taste. And most of the time, some people prefer while loops, other people prefer the for loops. I'll leave it up to you to play with both. And over time, you'll probably choose one or the other for most of your work. One tip, though, is in a particular PHP project, if you choose one looping technique, you probably want to stick to it just to be consistent. But anyway, that's just some nerd detail down the road. Hi, we're back. In this video tutorial, we're going to look over the last type of loop that we're going to cover in this video. And before we do that, though, I wanted to point out something about the for loop that I failed to mention in the previous section. And that is, if you notice, after each segment here, I end it with a semicolon. This is very important that you do that, semicolon, except for, of course, the last element here. You don't need a semicolon because it's the last element. So keep that in mind. So you initialize it, semicolon. This is the what you need to do, what's the condition. Basically, this is what the loop is operating off of. And this is what it does after it processes this. That said, now we're going to move over to what I feel is the coolest looping technique in PHP, and that is the for each loop. The for each loop was basically put together to make it really easy to loop through arrays. And thus, I've created an array up here for us to loop. So let's do it now, and we're going to see how easy it is. Since the array we're going to loop through is the shopping cart, excuse me, I'm just going to cut and paste that in. So I've created a new variable that the for each loop will use. And what we'll simply do is we'll just echo out the value of that particular item. So there you have it. Very simple loop. So basically, first thing we have to give it is the array. And then we have to give it a variable that will be used to represent each item in the array. So the for each loop basically looks into the array for us, grabs an item in the array, and then prints, does whatever we want with that, or with that item. It sticks it into this variable rather, and then we can do whatever we want with that. And then it keeps looping through the array until the array is has been looped through entirely. So let's save this, and we'll take a look at what it looks like on the page. Item fish, item dogs, item birds. Of course, this corresponds to our array here. What else can I point out about the for each loop? It's rather a simple one to use, so there's not much to say about it. It's a very important looping technique because when you're pulling records from a MySQL database, for instance, it actually comes back as an array. If you're parsing information from a form post, as we've learned in the previous video, it's actually a type of array. So the for each can be used quite a bit, and it makes grabbing information out of an array quite easy. Now, you could use a for loop to grab values from the array, but it would just take more work to build it. So I would just use for each. So that pretty much covers our basic look at looping in PHP. There's a few more details here and there, and there's another type of loop that you could use, but this I think is enough. We've learned about the while loop, the for loop, and the for each loop. And I hope you see the value in these things. You're going to be using them quite a bit in your PHP coding. I can guarantee you that. And I would suggest that what you do is create a bunch of loops and give it a go. There's nothing like actually getting your hands dirty in code to learn this stuff.